Hi guys, it's Geekonomics here, bringing you the next in the A2 Microeconomics series. You'll remember, and I hope recall, that the last video focused on the whole issue of monopsony, and today we are looking at monopsony but with a twist, the monopsony and the minimum wage. So I thought we would just start by recapping on the quite straightforward GCSE/AS level diagram, demand and supply diagram, with regard to the minimum wage, which you can see here. I hope this is familiar to you. So it's a fairly standard demand and supply diagram. Got the demand for labour, slopes downwards from left to right, supply of labour upwards from left to right. Where the two intersect, of course, that is our equilibrium level of employment and our equilibrium wage. I haven't actually annotated here the equilibrium level of employment just because it keeps the diagram that little bit simpler when we're annotating it and analysing it. So the minimum wage was introduced, of course, by the Labour government in order to boost the earnings of the lowest paid in the economy. And you can see that I have placed the minimum wage in the same way as you would a minimum price diagram. The minimum wage is being placed above the equilibrium. Here's our equilibrium, here is the minimum wage. When, and in theory anyway, and let's recall that this is in theory, a minimum wage will cause unemployment. Now, why will it cause unemployment? Well, it causes unemployment because if we go across from W min and we take our supply and demand points, so here is supply, quantity supplied, here is demand, quantity demanded. So this distance here, as you can see, I'm referring to as excess supply. What is it excess supply of? It's excess supply of labour, otherwise known as, of course, unemployment. And so the distance between the supply and demand curve, in theory anyway, when we introduce a minimum wage, should lead to unemployment. And indeed, ladies and gentlemen, that was the fear some years ago, whenever it was first mooted about the minimum wage, that it would actually introduce much more unemployment into the economy. Employers were coming on the radio and the news media saying, we cannot front up the cost, we cannot bear the cost of this ourselves. We will either have to, number one, increase our prices and pass the costs on to the customer. But of course you can only do that dependent upon the elasticity of demand for your product, the price elasticity of demand. Or we may not be able to bear the burden of this additional cost ourselves, so we might have to let people go and hence create unemployment. Now, in reality, I'm sure you're aware that that actually hasn't happened, and it hasn't happened for a number of reasons, some of which I wish to cite for you straight away, ladies and gentlemen. So before we do that, and I've just put this here by way of a reminder to me, in the A2 OCR textbook, the Peter Smith book, he talks about the constrained supply curve. Now, the constrained supply curve it's an interesting point, because if there were no minimum wage here, ladies and gentlemen, then all sorts of people would be willing to offer their labour at different wage rates. So, for example, at this wage rate here, it would be this quantity of labour. At this wage rate here, it would be this quantity of labour, and so on. Moving up the supply curve. However, when we introduce a minimum wage, it means that nobody is willing to work for anything less than that. Nobody's willing to work for anything less than W min. And so as a consequence, we could really, if I were able to do this on the board, we can almost airbrush out this portion of the supply curve of labour, because nobody is willing to work for anything less than W min. So all these people here who before the minimum wage was introduced said they would work at lower wage rates, now they all say they won't. And so from here downwards, all of this, right the way down, that all becomes redundant. And so we're left with a new supply curve, which Peter Smith calls the constrained supply curve. And our constrained supply curve, ladies and gentlemen, starts here, because no one will work for anything less than this, and then goes right across until we meet the original supply curve again, and only once this supply curve is above the wage, the minimum wage, does it then become active again, and so we move back onto it. And so our new supply curve is actually this, here to here, and then up once we rejoin the original supply curve at a wage rate higher than the minimum wage. Now Peter Smith refers to that in his textbook as the constrained supply curve. So why in practice, as opposed to in theory, why in practice does this minimum wage not lead to unemployment? Well, there are a few reasons why. Number one, any wage increases, firms have been able to say, look, we'll pay you this extra, but productivity is going to have to improve. Now you'll know, I'm sure, that we have a bit of a productivity issue in the UK. It's one of the key failings of the UK economy. That productivity lags behind our competitor nations. But in so doing, in encouraging productivity gains, it enables you then to offer higher wages, because you can offset the higher wages against your improvements in productivity. So that's one way of bearing the cost of that yourself as an employer. Secondly, you've got to ask yourself, here we have people, we have labour being paid. Well, it's not always the case that you can just sack off your labour and replace them with machinery, for example. That is not always the case. And so how easy is it to substitute capital for labour? If it's very difficult, then you can't simply get rid of your workforce. You'll just have to find you'll just have to be able to keep on employing those people, but maybe make cost savings in another area. The government are always talking about efficiency savings. Well, if a firm can make efficiency savings in other areas, then perhaps they can keep their labour force on. I mean, nowhere is this more evident than in the education system in the UK at the moment, where cuts are coming in, quite savage cuts in some places. And of course, for a school, 80% probably of its operational day-to-day running costs are staff costs. Well, you cannot simply replace G-economics with a machine, ladies and gentlemen. That just wouldn't work, would it? And so you therefore have to find savings elsewhere. You maybe find that you have to contract out services such as photocopying, such as catering, such as cleaning, and you try and bring your costs under control in that way, in order to perhaps ensure that you still have your labour and you can perhaps pay them the minimum wage. So the whole notion of substitutability is very important. I'd also like to just mention, whilst we're on the subject of the unemployment and the degree of the unemployment, if these demand and supply curves were more elastic, flatter, so let me see if I can just do this on this diagram, make this a little bit flatter possibly. Let's see. No, I can't. Okay. Can we? Yes, okay. So if that has made the demand curve more elastic. Let me just come off that. So the demand curve has become more elastic. And if I were to make the supply curve, let me see if I can tilt that one around as well. There we go. If I was to make the supply curve more elastic too, now we've got look at the gap between demand and supply. So this would be our supply, this would be our demand, and hence the extent of the unemployment would be much greater. So the elasticity of the demand for the labour and the supply of the labour, that is very important also. And then as a final point, ladies and gentlemen, what I did want to just come back to, if I may, is the whole notion of the living wage. Now, if I can just put this back, let me just undo these changes. So we're back at our original. If we take the case of the living wage, which is higher than the minimum wage, then we would have a scenario like this. We would have a scenario whereby the living wage is potentially even up here. And theoretically, at least, that would generate even more unemployment. You can see that the demand and supply points would be, there's your supply down there and there's your demand. So the difference between supply and demand is much greater, and so the excess supply is greater, and so you might get more unemployment. So that's also something worth thinking about. But of course, do remember what's going on in reality and compare it to what's going on in theory. So that's the traditional minimum wage diagram, ladies and gentlemen. Let's now move on to the monopsonist and the minimum wage. If you don't know what monopsony is, then go to my previous video and check it out and run through that first of all. I'm not going to go through the whole how we get all of these equilibrium points and so on and so forth here. All I want to talk about here is the minimum wage for the monopsonist. So you'll recall from the previous video that the perfectly competitive wage would be here, where demand equals supply, and the monopsonist wage would be here. Now, something which, a term which I meant to use in the previous video but just forgot really. Remember we said that the monopsonist forces the wage rate down to the bare minimum that the market will tolerate, and that's shown on the supply curve. Well, remember, we can also refer to that, ladies and gentlemen, in the labour market theory, we can refer to that as transfer earnings. So don't forget to throw that one in. It's just a little note to self really there. With regard to the minimum wage, what would happen here? Well, we could impose a minimum wage anywhere really. We could impose it anywhere in between WMON and WPC, or even potentially above WPC. For the sake of this little demonstration, I've put it halfway between the two. And you can see that the minimum wage, again, it would generate this thing called a constrained supply curve. Why is that? Well, the reason is, of course, because once more, nobody will work for less than WMIN. And so on this diagram, ladies and gentlemen, this section of the supply curve here, that becomes redundant. And so the supply curve for the monopsonist with this minimum wage imposed would be from WMIN, so from here, over to the original supply curve. And then once we pick up the original supply curve and the wage rate starts to rise above the minimum, then we rejoin that supply curve. And so the constrained supply curve in this case goes from here to here, rejoins the original, and then follows that original path again. And that is how we get the constrained supply curve in this particular diagram. Now, again, we can say a few things about demand and supply here. So, for example, and I haven't annotated this because it starts to make the diagram a little bit messy and untidy, but if we take the minimum wage here, for example, you can see that the demand for labour, the demand would be here, and the supply would be, ladies and gentlemen, the supply would be here for on the original supply curve. So you can see demand once again greater than supply, in this case excess demand. Now one would think that the excess demand would therefore bid the wage rate upwards. But of course the thing to remember is that the monopsonists, because they have the market power, they have the ability to force the wage rate down to its bare minimum, to the transfer earnings position. So don't forget that. One would think that it would be bid upwards and there'd be upside pressures here, but that is not the case for the monopsony employer. So we've talked about constrained supply, where the position of WMIN, whether it be sort of close to WMON or close to WPC, that would of course depend upon the bargaining power of the two groups involved. Because we'd have, on the one hand, we'd have a trade union representative, and on the other hand, we'd have an employers association. And the two of them would be at loggerheads as to where they wanted the wage to go. If the union had more power, then obviously we'd expect the minimum wage to be coming up closer to perfect competition. If, on the other hand, the employer or the employers association had the greater power, then they would obviously be trying to get it as close to WMON as they could. So don't forget that sort of whole relationship, which is referred to in your textbook, your green OCR textbook, as the bilateral monopsony position. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, that's all really. That's certainly, it's all that you need to know anyway, with regard to the monopsonist and the minimum wage diagram. So we'll leave that, ladies and gentlemen. And as ever, like, subscribe, pass on to friends and family, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.